Okay, I think the numbers are stable.
Sorry, Susie?
I said that it's slowing down, so I think you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this CEDIL webinar on the evidence-based project cycle. My name is Radhika Menon. I lead on research uptake here at CEDIL. For those of you new to CEDIL, CEDIL stands for the Center of Excellence for Development Impact and Learning. We're funded by UK Aid. We focus on innovative methods for evaluation and evidence synthesis, and the projects that we focus on or support broadly fall into three areas: evaluating complex interventions, enhancing evidence transferability, and promoting evidence use. And the CEDIL webinar series aims to promote conversations in all of these three areas. Today's webinar focuses on the evidence-based project cycle. We talk a lot about evidence use, but there's often lack of clarity of what sort of evidence is used when. And today's presentation is going to be led off by Howard White. Howard needs no introduction. He is the CEO of Campbell Collaboration and the research director of CEDIL. His presentation will be focusing on a presentation of a framework that can be used for planning the production and use of evidence. And we're very grateful to have Ian Goldman here with us as our discussant. Ian is currently an advisor on evaluation and evidence systems at Clear Anglophone Africa, but before that he was the Deputy Director General at the Department of Policy Monitoring and Evaluation in South Africa. And he's really led on the institutionalization of evidence within the government, and more recently he's written a book which is on evidence use in policy and practice. So those interested in this area should go read that book. A couple of housekeeping rules. This webinar is going to be recorded. Please use the Q&A function to post your questions or comments. And do fill in the webinar survey at the end. You'll be redirected to a page. We really value your feedback, so please do fill in the survey. And if you're tweeting, do use the hashtag CEDILwebinar or tag the CEDIL handle. So with that, I hand over to Howard, who will start off with his presentation. You're on mute, Howard. You're on mute.
I'm not.
Now we can hear you. Go ahead.
So welcome everyone. You'll see I changed the name a bit to the evidence cycle for the 4 Ps because it covers policy, programs, projects and practice. The same principles apply regardless of which of those 4 Ps you're talking about. This talk is actually part of what I would say is a series of talks around my vision for the evidence architecture. One is the 4 waves of evidence evolution, which I presented a few times. There's a paper, then there's this presentation. There's one on enhancing transferability using mid-level theory, which I presented a couple of times, and there's some CEDIL papers on that. And finally a presentation on strategic use of evidence maps. So I'm going to talk about some of those ideas during this talk, but there are other resources you can go to learn more about those parts of this overall vision. So the key question here, as Radhika mentioned in the introduction, is what sort of evidence we need. And the evidence you need depends on where you are in this cycle, in this evidence-based cycle for policy, practice, programs and projects. And this is the cycle. So I'm going to come back to this cycle several times as I go through it. So I'm not going to go through it now. I'm going to go through it during the course of the next 35, 40 minutes. And I'm going to start by focusing at the top of the cycle. And I'm going to spend the most time at the top of the cycle, how you identify a proposed program on the basis of evidence, because I think that's the most neglected part of this cycle. I think all the way around, we need more evidence at all stages of the cycle, but it really is the identification of proposed programs where I believe the use of evidence is weakest. And there are little arrows all over this diagram which represent the fact that it's iterative and interactive. So any stage, you can go back to the preceding stage or back to the beginning, depending on what the evidence shows up. So we want to select an intervention, proposed program, policy, practice, project, or extend a project, revise a policy, or whatever. And there are three elements to that, and three different types of evidence we can use. Actually 4 types, but 3 different main approaches we're going to use in identifying a proposed program. The first one is to know, is this a problem? Is it an issue? So we want to look at prevalence data around to see whether the issue is a substantial issue or not, and I will give examples in a moment. And we also want to identify, well, why is it a problem? This thing X is common, but is it a problem to have X? It might be having orange hairs, not that common, happens, but it's a problem. The second thing is formative research. And as I go on, you'll see I distinguish between formative research and formative evaluation. And formative research is really to identify, well, you want to achieve an outcome, why? What are the binding constraints preventing the outcome being achieved? And so any intervention should be tackling the binding constraints. Because if it's not, then whatever you do won't be effective because the binding constraints are still present. And then finally, we want to look at the existing evidence base on what works. So you should be using evidence-based decision-making products, which I'll come back to, and think also about transferability of evidence from one setting to your setting, which is where mid-level theory comes in, as I've said, isn't that whole program of work within CEDIL. So I'm going to take 2 examples. The first one is about poor learning outcomes. So the figure here is from a report called the Annual States of Education Report that's published by Pratham in India. This graphic is a few years old now. What it showed when this study was done, so it's 2015 or something, when this study was done, barely 5 out of 10 children in standard 5 can read at standard 2 level. So it's not that half children in standard 5 can't read at standard 5 level, it's half children at standard 5 cannot read at standard 2 level. And similarly, we go to arithmetic, only 2 out of 10 children in standard 5 can solve a simple 3-digit sum like 405 divided by 5. So only 2 out of 10 children in standard 5 can solve that simple mathematical problem. So serious problem in poor learning outcomes. So that shows the prevalence of the problem. That yes, it's really a big problem. So you can use that information as Pratham have for advocacy work around there's a learning outcome crisis in India, but also across the developing world, across South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa for sure. And you can also, of course, look at the breakdown of the prevalence by geographically, by social economic status and so on, to identify where the problem is most severe, to target an intervention to the areas with the highest prevalence of this problem. But as well as saying it is a problem, you want saying it's a common problem, it's a common issue, you want to actually say, well, why it's a problem. And I don't think many people question why lack of having basic educational skills, literacy and arithmetic is a problem, but just in case they do, it clearly is. So what are the benefits of education? There are benefits in terms of both individual and social from productivity, income and well-being. That's true certainly for people wanting to go and work in the formal sector, but even in the informal sector, the ability to keep books, to read instructions for fertilizer or so on, depend on improved seeds and so on, depend on literacy. When agricultural extension services like farmer field schools target their programs, often say, I will only work with literate farmers. So the lack of these basic skills constrains people's productivity and therefore their income and therefore their well-being. The returns to education are well established, most stylized facts that we can take as being so well established we shouldn't really doubt it. Their returns to education, but work that looks at learning outcomes does show the returns are not to education per se, they are returns to learning. There's well-established link between learning outcomes and maternal and child health. There's established links between political community participation and education, those education more likely to vote and so on. And then there's socialisation, which has been seen as a critique of education, it's just to socialise people, but there are positive aspects of socialisation. The society functions well when people are socialised to a certain degree. And so education certainly clearly has benefits. And so we're failing to actually educate people in the education system. That's a problem. So the first thing is establish it's a problem. Second thing is do formative research on binding constraints. So what is it that's stopping people learning? So these are data not school-based data, they come from data across all children. And so the first question is, well, just are children going to school? And if they're not, what's the reason? It might be there is no school in their locality, or the nomadic populations or street-connected children who don't have access to school. It might be fees, including not direct fees, but indirect fees like paying for a school uniform. It might be child labour. And when I say child labour, don't think of children toiling away in sweatshop factories. It can also include household chores like collecting water, looking after siblings. When at 3IE we financed a study of preschool intervention in Mozambique, and one finding was that providing preschool to young children increased the school enrolment of their elder siblings, because the elder siblings were freed up from childcare responsibilities. And then early marriage, but when girls get married, they typically come out of school. So all of those are reasons why children might not be in school. Identifying the dominant reason in the area where we want to increase learning outcomes, you have to tackle that reason. Don't tackle another reason. But maybe the children are all in school. That's not the problem. So if they are in school, then what's the quality of the learning environment? And that can be teacher absenteeism, poorly qualified teachers. It's not unusual for teachers to start teaching children to pass an exam. Those teachers themselves just failed recently. Is class size an issue? Class size of 60, 70 and so on are common. You get mixed grade classes, so you get different grades, say 4, 5 and 6 into the same class. It's very difficult to teach appropriately. There's an absence of textbooks, absence of exercise books. And then there's this emergent now of issues that weren't previously considered development issues, but being realised to be very important. So, for example, bullying and sexual abuse in schools, which we now know, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is extremely prevalent and clearly a problem to girls both attending school, but also staying actively engaged in school. And then there's how appropriate pedagogical approaches. So learning environment looks good, but how is teaching being done? So time on task has been shown to be a big issue. Children are in the classroom, teachers there, they're not actually spending much time on task, actually learning. Medium of instruction is an issue. So most countries move to English as the medium of instruction at some point, but if you've got children that come from a non-English speaking background, doing that too soon is problematic for their learning. It's demonstrated they don't learn anything, basically. And so the point at which you switch languages is a very clearly important policy issue, but of course it's also a political issue. Rote learning is still very common, we know to be less effective, and teaching at the wrong level, because children don't know very much because their education has been inadequate. Just keeping going through the curriculum as if they do know what they're meant to know can be an incorrect thing to do. So there's quite a lot of focus now on teaching at the right level. And then finally, is the home environment conducive to learning? So again, child labour, thinking household chores, lack of electricity, lack of parental education. So parents may value education, want their children to go to school, but not themselves be equipped to help children with their homework and so on. So there's a lot of reasons here why children might not be learning. And you want to be able to identify the right one through formative research to be able to know what your project should be about. And it's quite remarkable the extent to which formative research doesn't seem to be done. I mean, I'm not showing an actual example here because I couldn't find one. And so there's very little formative research being done. People do projects or programs, they think, oh, this is what we want to do. You know, there's a problem, this is the problem, so we'll do this to fix it, without really actually trying to understand, well, what are the causes of that problem. This is very unlike the private sector, which invests heavily in market research before it launches a product. We don't have the same standards in public sector aid finance interventions to adequate research to underpin the rationale for an intervention. And then the final stage is, okay, this is the problem, here are the reasons why that problem's happening, and then third, what's the existing evidence say? And for that, you should look at evidence-based decision-making products. There are things, evidence portals, like the Teaching Learning Toolkit, the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK. I'll come back and talk about that later on. And there's a new publication by the World Bank on cost-effective approaches to improving learning. These products should be based on systematic reviews. The one on the left, Teaching Learning Toolkit is, the one on the right is not. So I prefer the one on the left, but hopefully we can get the bank also more towards a systematic review approach in time. Second example is teenage pregnancy. I say in Ghana, my examples come across sub-Saharan Africa, and the general rate of teenage pregnancy and early marriage is between 1/4 and 1/3 across sub-Saharan Africa, so it's a common problem. So in prevalence data from the Demographic and Health Survey in Ghana show that 7% of pregnancies overall are unwanted, 25% of missed time. I actually don't have the data for teenage pregnancy, but it's 1/3 of pregnancies, 1/3 of girls before the age 18 have become pregnant or had a child, and around 1/4 are married before the age of 18. Unwanted pregnancies linked to unsafe abortion, it's a contributor to maternal mortality and so on. And of course, you can identify from data like DHS data where contraceptive need is the highest. So why is teenage pregnancy a problem? I put early marriage and teenage pregnancy together because they are not always, of course, linked. You have quite a lot of children out of wedlock amongst teenagers, but early marriage and teenage pregnancy are closely linked. It's a problem because girls get dropped out of school, either because they get married or just because they get pregnant. The girls who have younger children are less educated, clearly younger mothers, and younger mothers are less able mothers, and they're less empowered in the relationships they have. And the earlier the first birth is, so they have a first birth at 15, 16 rather than 19, 20, it's linked to subsequent higher fertility, of course, and it's linked to child cognitive and nutritional and general child development problems, and higher mortality, as I already mentioned, both amongst the children and amongst the mothers. So it's a common issue, it's a common problem, it's high rates between 1/4 and 1/3, and it is a problem because of all these reasons. So what about formative research? Why is it a problem? So here I did find a formative research study funded by UNICEF. It's in Uganda, not Ghana, so not necessarily entirely transfer. But what was found was that early marriage remains very common, linked to the physical transition to adulthood, which in girls, of course, occurs normally sometime between 12, 14, and 15. And strong association between that physical transition, puberty, towards the idea of becoming a woman, the expectation you become sexually active, get married, and have a child. And so there's strong social norms around that that prevents combating early marriage or early first birth in communities where these traditional social norms hold sway. But at the same time, there's also a view of weakening social cohesion, and particularly the donor-led agenda for children's rights actually undermined parental and grandparental authority. And so teenagers actually had more autonomy and did their own thing much more, particularly, of course, in urban environments. That also was linked to the rise in teenage pregnancy. And then, just as in developed countries, children from disadvantaged backgrounds, single parents, living in poverty and so on, being sent out to work, lack the protective factors. They're much higher risk in order to make them more likely to become pregnant. So interventions want to tackle norms, to try and find ways to connect with children who are getting unlinked from the sort of authority structures that would help them behave better. That can also, mentors and role models, things can play a role there. And then you want protective factors from children disadvantaged families who are more disproportionately likely to become pregnant. What do you know about what works? This is quite an old Campbell review, and this is looking at sexual experience rates by different types of program. And basically, the top bar, the lighter purple bar, shows the sexual experience rate for teenagers in the intervention group and across a range of studies as a review. And dark purple shows the sexual experience rates in the comparison group. And basically, you see this is sex education, sex abstinence, fun time consultations, so on. Nothing's working. The only thing that makes a little bit of difference, but it's not a lot, is multi-component programs. Of course, this is sexual experience. What you're interested in is pregnancy, and they might be sexually active and not get pregnant using contraception. But you see pretty much the same story here. No impact really on pregnancy, except for the multi-component programs, where the 95% confidence interval, that long line, doesn't overlap. So there does seem to be a small gain in reducing teenage pregnancy from multi-component programs. That review does need updating, but the main lesson is that there's not much evidence that many programs are effective. So, but multi-components seem most effective. So whatever you do should be multi-component, and there's other reasons for thinking that based on behavior change models, but also it needs to be tested. You can't take for granted anything you do is going to work, because most things don't work. So whatever you do, you should go out and test it as part of the program. So as I said, I distinguish between formative research and formative evaluation. Formative research helps understand the nature of the problem and identify possible solutions, whereas this formative research can use both quant and qual methods. I won't go much into that. Formative evaluation is to test new or redesigned programs. and in particular to test for technical feasibility or acceptability. So you do formative research before you select a program. It helps you pick a program. You do formative evaluation once you've picked a program and you want to sort of like try it out a bit. How does this fly when I try and do it on a very small scale? And the main things you're looking at, is it technically feasible and is it acceptable to people? Do people want it? And it uses similar methods to a process evaluation. So formative evaluation will be largely qualitative. You might do a bit of quantitative data on take-up rates or something, adoption rates, but largely it's a qualitative study. So pilot testing of a program goes in 2 stages. First, the formative evaluation stage I'm talking about, which is a process evaluation, and efficacy trials, which I'll come back to in a moment, which and efficacy trials have an impact evaluation component, meaning they have a treatment group and a comparison group. And they should have a process evaluation as well, because all impact evaluations should be mixed methods. So now I'm moving around the cycle. I'm talking about formative evaluation in the local context. They've got a program that seems to work elsewhere, seems to address the problem you've got. And so does it work? So a couple of examples. These are some 3IA funded studies. In Pakistan, the common treatment for TB around the world is DOTS, which is facility-based treatment for TB, so it's expensive. The problem is that you don't use facility-based treatment, people don't take the medication according to protocol, and that can lead to the emergence of new treatment-resistant strains, drug-resistant strains of TB. So you want people to stick to protocol. So the idea of this program is to incentivize people to take their medicine correctly, not in the facility. So they were given this stick, and once they took their medication, after an hour or so, they're meant to urinate on the stick. A little code would come up if they had taken the medicine, and then they could text in the code and get some credit for their phone. So they're being incentivized to take the medicine by getting extra credit on their phone. And I was presenting this study as an example, sort of like a clever sort of study, and then one of the staff from 3I told me, but you do know that the sticks don't work. So all these people are peeing on these sticks, and hard as how they pee, no code's coming up. So the things just didn't work in field conditions. This was a project designed by a team in Harvard, but clearly they hadn't tested the sticks under field conditions, or whatever the reason is, the sticks just didn't work. And then they turned the program into an mHealth text reminder program. So technical feasibility, we shouldn't have funded that impact evaluation, because we should have done, someone should have done formative testing to start with. Acceptability, so in the Philippines, PhilHealth, the National Health Insurance Agency, sent out 1,000 texts to people, SMS texts, to people saying, okay, rather than paying 600 pesos, about $30, for the insurance for PhilHealth, you can pay just 300 pesos. So sign up now and get this discount. And of the 1,000 messages sent out, 7 people replied to take up the offer. So this wasn't the constraint. It wasn't that they lowering the price made people sign up. There are other reasons why people weren't signing up. There were some clues why that was given by the study. I don't have time to go into them, but the money wasn't the binding constraint here. So you want to tackle the binding constraint. So this is an example of medical male contraception. That's what this device is for, medical male contraception. And if you go around and ask people in high HIV prevalence areas, it's known that male circumcision cuts the risk of getting HIV from unprotected sex. Around 3/4 of men say, yes, I'd like to get circumcised. But actually, when the men turn up on the doorstep with the scissors, as happened here, it goes right down. So rather than 3/4 that said they wanted it, only 25% took it if it was free, and 10% took it with a partial substitute. And so cost price did make a difference, not that much of a difference. Still, the vast majority didn't want it even though it was free. Another example was a subsidized preschool program in Mexico. Parents actually had to register for the program, were told they might get a free place. Once they were given the free place, only 10% of those parents actually took up the free place. Another program gave people 3 bank accounts on the idea that transaction cost of setting up a bank account would stop people to open bank accounts. But only 20% of them actually started using the account, and the research team put free money in the account. You can go and use this account, it's there, it's set up in your name, and we put money in it. You can just go and take the money out and never do anything else again. And 1/3 of them didn't even take out the free money. So there's another constraint, something else going on there. And insurance schemes, I mentioned already, Philippines, 7 out of 1,000. In Pakistan, the ultra poor were given a white plastic card. We just had to take the white plastic card to a public health centre, get free point of use treatment. Fewer than 1% use the card. So clearly, cost is not the binding constraint. It might be a bit of a constraint, but it's not the binding constraint. So none of his interventions were addressing what's the binding constraint. You need to do formative research first. If you haven't, when you do formative evaluation, you're going to find these problems and say, we shouldn't do this program anymore. There's no point going to an impact evaluation stage. So here's a good example of formative evaluation from neonatal care in rural Ghana to identify the importance of community engagement activities, getting women to self-identify, not relying on health workers to identify pregnant women, and to motivate the volunteer, because normally these rely on volunteer health workers, through community recognition. And then make sure there's a feedback loop from this information into program design. There's no point doing a formative evaluation if you don't then use the information to improve program design. Go back to the diagram, you'll see that, the arrows there. Here's an inappropriate use of formative evaluation. So also in Ghana, they looked at what they called was the effectiveness of a package of maternal, neonatal and child survival interventions using outcome monitoring and stakeholder interviews and 2 focus group discussions. And based on that, they recommended basically operationalizing this newborn strategy nationwide. You shouldn't be doing that, okay? This evaluation design, talking to some people, looking at outcome monitoring, cannot establish effectiveness and is not the basis for a rollout. It's a basis for saying, okay, we've learned something, hopefully, because there's no lessons here. We've learned something, and we'll build that into doing the program at the next stage, which is efficacy testing. So we've done the formative evaluation, maybe made a bit of changes to program design, then we go to the pilot program. So efficacy, you need to test. Now we start doing impact evaluation, which should be randomized controlled trials where possible. And what we've learned over the last 15 years is RCTs are much more possible than we thought in many more different settings. And you can be using at this stage already A/B designs with different intervention designs to see what works most effectively. We want to communicate about program to people. Let's do that in different ways and see which work better. We want to try and encourage people to stick to their medication. Let's try different ways of doing that and see which ones work better. Different text messages, try those, see which work better and so on. Building this adaptive learning impact evaluation approach all the way through the program from now on. And then you've got, that's pilot stage 2, is efficacy testing. If it's proven to work at the efficacy stage, then you should actually go to the effectiveness stage. This is just like clinical trials for drugs. They go for efficacy testing and effectiveness testing as they're rolled out. In reality, a lot of drugs don't do this. They get NDO approval, FDA approval at stage 2. And they say, we promise, we'll do stage 3, and they never do. And it's the same with development interventions. So most of the studies that we financed at 3A when I was there, most studies done by JPA and IPA, they would count as efficacy studies, done on relatively small scale, done often with researcher involvement and implementation, not as they will be rolled out in practice. There are some exceptions. Other research groups like REAP in China do much more effective stage RCTs, but most of the RCTs we see are actually efficacy studies. So you need to roll out and test its effectiveness. You should be using mixed methods. So all of these stages, so efficacy and effectiveness, combining the rigorous impact evaluation design, either experimental or non-experimental, with a process evaluation, qualitative data collection that will give you more information around implementation issues that you won't get from the quantitative study alone. A couple of examples of RCTs. This was around industrial pollution in Gujarat, and it introduced a new auditing mechanism for pollution monitoring, and the new mechanism was much more effective than the existing mechanism. So the treatment group didn't get nothing, they got the existing way of auditing pollution, and the new mechanism led to more accurate reports after the first year and a reduction in emissions after the second year, and was adopted by Gujarat and adopted by other states afterwards as a result of this study. Another study in Zambia tried to incentivize using social recognition and payments and comparing social recognition payments, hairdressers to sell female condoms. And it did find that social recognition worked more than payments, but the effect size in terms of selling female condoms wasn't very large. But the Ministry of Health was interested in the study and asked the research team to think of incentive structures for community health workers as well. And the subsequently went on and tried those out as well. So you can learn from one intervention and say, well, that's a good idea. It's like mid-level theory. That idea of incentivizing social recognition, I heard about already in Ghana, is a good idea. Let's try that with another set of workers that we're interested in. So once we've done that, we want to go to scale by going to effectiveness. That means we want to replicate the program in different contexts. So different people taking the program and trying in different contexts, different settings, some variations in program design. And we want to be answering second generation questions, which I'll just briefly address. Then we synthesize the evidence across studies. So first generation questions are, does it work? So conditional cash transfer, does it increase in school enrollment? Does it increase in health facilities? Does it reduce poverty? That's just first generation question, does it work? Second generation questions address design issues. How can you design this program to make it more effective? How large should the transfer be? What should the frequency of payment be? Who do you give the money to and how? How do you get last mile delivery to remote populations? What's the nature and the number of conditions that are appropriate and can be realistically applied? And so once we know something works, like we do with CCT, we want to be learning much more about looking under the hood and seeing, well, how can we make this work better? So there's no point doing just one more study on CCT. So, oh, if you give a CCT education conditions increases enrollment, we know that, unless there's 100% enrollment already. But actually learning more about how to design the program would really be useful. And set the basis of evidence-based guidelines, which I'm going to come to in 1 second. So we want to take all that evidence we've got a growing body of evidence, we want to learn from that body of evidence, so we should systematically review it to put it into systematic reviews. And that's what Campbell collaboration does, it's systematic reviews of social and economic interventions in both developed and developing countries. Some things don't work, so this is a review from 3IE, looking at the community-driven development programs and social cohesion, and we've got 20-odd studies here, not one of them finds an effect on social cohesion. So it's a forest plot. Sorry, I'm not familiar with forest plots. I love forest plots, they're great. So in a forest plot, every row is a study, and the dot in the middle is the effect size estimate, the average treatment effect. The line is the 95% confidence interval, and that line, horizontal line, crosses the vertical line, the line of no effect. Then that study found no effect on that outcome. So CDD programs do achieve some positive things. There are a lot of positive things to say about the report. What they don't do is improve social cohesion. None of the studies found an effect on social cohesion. But most importantly, when you do the meta-analysis, which is a little diamond at the bottom, the meta-analysis shows that overall the effect size is basically zero. There's no effect on social cohesion. So this is one example of something we know, we learned. This doesn't work, doesn't do this. Some programs are actually harmful. This is an example of Scared Straight, a developed country program. So youth who are thought to be at risk of crime or committed minor offences get exposed to what prison life is like. They're taken onto a prison, meet criminals, and meant to tell them like how horrible it is and so on. But actually what the evidence shows is Scared Straight makes youth more likely to become criminals, not less likely. The program actually has a counteractive effect, called nitrogenic effect. Actually is counterproductive, actually has a harmful effect, increases crime rather than reduces it. But some things do work. Another crime example, hotspot policing. So 80% of crimes are geographically concentrated in what are called police and crime hotspots. And if you focus the police in those crime hotspots, then you reduce crime with no spillover effects to neighbouring areas. So the initial evidence came mainly from the US, but this has now been tried in several countries in Latin America, and there are new randomized control trials in a number of countries in Latin America, started with Caribbean, started Trinidad and Tobago, and now Colombia and some other countries which have RCTs of hotspot policing. So the review led to the adoption of the program, testing the program elsewhere, and we see continued evidence that it's an effective approach. So now we've got these reviews. The systematic reviews are big, weighty documents. Our Word review is 700 pages long. So we don't reasonably expect decision makers to read those products. So what we want to do is to create evidence-based decision-making products. These evidence-based decision-making products are meant to enable decision makers to make decisions without having to go back and look at the evidence. So this is the knowledge brokering pyramid or knowledge translation pyramid that's in my 4 Waves paper and my 4 Waves presentations. And so it takes us through the stage from doing studies, reviews, and so on, to making the top of the evidence pyramid evidence portals, like the toolkit I showed earlier, we'll show again in a second, like guidelines like WHO produces and like checklists. So, for example, WHO produces international guidelines on a range of topics, and many countries use WHO guidelines to inform their national guidelines. And the WHO has guidelines on producing guidelines. It's called the Handbook on Guideline Development. And the Handbook on Guideline Development says that guidelines must be based on systematic reviews. So the whole pyramid is based on having primary studies you can review, and having reviews there that can go into evidence portals, guidelines, and checklists. So it's evidence-based decision-making products, EPDMs, or EPDMPs, EPDMPs are really, in my mind, how you institutionalize the evidence revolution. And until we have these evidence-based decision-making products being used on a routine basis across all sectors, across international development, we won't achieve the evidence revolution. It's far too ad hoc in the way it's being done. It's creating a system like WHO has for having EPDMPs across the board. So we could do one now for CCTs, which we have enough studies. We could be doing reviews in every aspect. What we should do, and I'll say in a moment, do an evidence map, identify the reviews. If there aren't reviews, do reviews, and use those reviews to write guidelines on evidence-based. I've sorted this by impact. So feedback is the most powerful thing you can do. It's relatively cheap. It's relatively cheap, and it also has a very large impact. It's like nearly a whole additional year's schooling by giving a child feedback on their work. Other things you can also do that are very effective. There's some things like repeating a year that are actually very expensive and actually counterproductive. The child learns less than if they hadn't repeated a year. So things like this are great. 2/3 of schools in England use this to decide how to allocate school resources and what to do in the classroom. So 2/3 of schools in England make evidence-based decisions on how to run their schools based on this toolkit, which is based on systematic reviews. Doesn't mean head teachers in these schools read reviews. They probably don't know what a review is, but here they have the evidence. And you can click down to what's called the second level of the toolkit, which gives you information about the intervention, and you can click down to the third level, which is the underlying technical report review. You don't need to do that because everything you need to know is in the first and second level. So what we'd like to see is a strategic approach to use evidence and gap maps. We use them. We want to get evidence used by using the top 3 layers. But the top, you can't have the top without having the bottom. So you need the bottom of the pyramid, have the top of the pyramid. And what evidence maps do is survey the base of the pyramid. They say, well, what's down there, to know whether you can actually build the top or you need to actually do more work on the base of the pyramid before you can think about building the top. So EGMs not lending themselves, but a step towards further work. So I'm going to a couple of examples and I'm done. So one of the first papers we commissioned at CEDIL was the map of maps. So it was a map of existing evidence and gap maps in international development. It's there, you can go and look at it on our website, and it identified 73 existing or ongoing maps. And from that, we identified 3 new maps we'd commissioned under CEDIL: access to justice, transport, and disability. It's the top one I'm going to talk about. It's up there, you can go and see it. And from that, we did initially 5 rapid reviews commissioned by DFID, it was FCDO, which were undertaken in collaboration with the International Centre for Evidence Disability at London School of Hygiene. And so ICE holds a grant for another DFID program, SDO program called PENDA. So PENDA is now financing full reviews based on these of these topics. And these reviews are based on the map. So we don't go and do a new search. We use the studies we found in the map. We updated the map for the PENDA reviews to see which studies go into the map. Most importantly, based on the map and the reviews, and again with CEDIL financing, ICE produced a disability evidence portal, like the evidence toolkit. So based on systematic reviews, here's a portal that allows decision makers working in inclusive disability development to go and to know what the evidence says, without having to go back and read the reviews. So we've got this chain here where we start with a map and we go through to an evidence portal. So we at Campbell are using the same approach for a number of what work centres in the UK. So here's just one example. Youth Endowment Fund is to tackle serious youth violence for 10 to 14-year-olds in England and Wales. we've done evidence and gap map of 2,000 studies. Based on the evidence and gap map versus evidence summaries, which inform the commissioning of new primary studies. We said that here are areas where we don't know anything, go commission some primary studies. And then where there were reviews, we wrote the technical reports, which are the third level of the toolkit. And where we saw there are no reviews, we said go and commission reviews. So we're currently doing and commissioning new reviews, but the existing reviews we found that fitted the scope, we wrote technical reports that go into building the toolkit. And that's ongoing, the toolkit's coming out in a couple of months' time. So this is a strategic approach. Do a map first, identify what the basic pyramid looks like, use what you can to build the top of the pyramid. When you haven't got sufficient information in the bottom of the pyramid, not enough primary study reviews, go out and commission them and get them done. So that's my vision of doing it. And you think, well, yeah, that's just obvious, isn't that what people are doing anyway? And the answer is no, they're not. So back in many years ago, my father had this book called The Peter Principle. And this is the cover of the one he had. And the Peter Principle is a management principle that people rise to their level of incompetence. So basically, you're very good at doing, at a certain job, you get promoted to the next grade, you're good at that job, get promoted to the next grade, and you keep getting promoted till you reach a job you're not good at. And so all organizations are populated by people who are not very good at their jobs. And the evidence Peter principle is evidence being used for a purpose which is not appropriate. It either gets promoted to a use it's not right for. That's not invalid evidence, it's only valid for a certain research question. So we see outcome monitoring being used to answer impact evaluation questions. You can't do that by the counterfactual. You can't answer impact questions using factual data, outcome monitoring alone. Or you see stakeholder opinions being used to measure impact. Again, stakeholder opinions about projects are very useful in process evaluations, but not to determine if the project had an impact or not. Second, you see formative research being used by programs, formative research on problems being used to pose programs and actually looking at what works. So I didn't present it, but there's another example from Ghana again, where they had this evidence-based education program, so-called, where they did accurately assess what the problems were, but didn't look at any existing evidence about what works to address those problems. They called the program evidence-based, even though it actually hadn't looked at evidence-based or what interventions were effective or not. Formative evaluation of efficacy trials are used to recommend national rollout. You should only do that based on effectiveness. So you go to efficacy, go to effectiveness, then it's okay, it's working effectiveness stage, let's roll it out. And finally, using single studies to inform global evidence products. The best known case, of course, being deworming, where Deworm the World promotes school-based deworming programs, despite the fact that review evidence doesn't support them being used for the purpose they say. There's a very small minority of studies in Africa that have those findings, but not the majority of studies from the rest of the world. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening. That's the end of my talk. We've got back to the chair now, but do sign up for our newsletter if you've not already done so.
Thanks very much, Howard. I'm going to invite Ian now. Ian, over to you. Ian, we can't hear you. We can see your screen though. Ian, you may be on mute.
He's not on mute. I think his sound isn't working.
Oops, okay.
So it's in the chat. You can see that.
Yeah. No.
No.
Not yet. We can see you're saying something. No, not yet.
Ian, if you click on the little arrow next to the mute button, it allows you to select your microphone source. I think you may have done it completely.
So while Ian looks at maybe the settings, Howard, you could look at some of the questions that have been coming in the Q&A function. Some interesting questions there. If you'd like to answer a couple, that'd be great.
So I see the question about the how far do you go and understand the constraints? So the examples given of child labour, do you just say, well, child labour is a constraint, or do you try and understand why child labour is a constraint? So yeah, clearly you do want to go a bit further up the chain to understand why the constraint is there. So to understand, say, teacher absenteeism would be to understand what the system is placed that's allowing teacher absenteeism to occur, but also understand teachers' own motivation. Teacher absenteeism might be, pay is inadequate. They have to go to the town to pick up their pay once a month anyway, one day a month at least. It's not, they're never there. They're not there all the time they're meant to be. So to understand what lays behind those constraints clearly would be necessary. And the second question is on cost. Well, like you can do all this, and you don't spend the entire project budget before you actually start the project. So I understand that. I have two responses. One is the obvious one is, well, if you're going to do a project that has no effect, better to not do it, to spend the money on the research. But the other is, of course, a lot of this, and that's partly true, but the research doesn't cost so much, to be honest, compared to average World Bank project of 10 million or 12 million or whatever. But that's actually a small bank project, a bank project of 150, 200 million. But the main point, and maybe why the bank should be financing it, not an NGO, is a lot of these are global public goods. So if you do a good piece of formative research on education, girls' education in a country, that will give sufficient ideas not to just identify one intervention, but a whole host of interventions. So like the study I showed up for Uganda on early marriage and teen pregnancy, that should help inform a host of organisations doing programmes. So these are public goods. The problem is, of course, there's not a lot of money around for public goods these days, but that's the job of the multilateral development programmes, multilateral agencies, is to fund public goods. And so they really should be funding things like this, both globally, but also down at national level. So when you have these donor sector groups who do have resources at their disposal, and they should be thinking about doing this sort of things. Actually, the Ghana example I mentioned was come out of a sector approach, and it was done by the Global Partnership for Education, but they didn't understand what evidence was appropriate for what use. So I think that, I take the point about costs, but I do believe that it's done not on a project by project basis. It will be not so expensive to do because costs are spread. And the prevalence data, you don't go and collect the prevalence data, are there already. They're in demographic and health surveys, living standard measurement surveys, and so on. that are in the public domain. So you can consult a valuable data source for that. I mean, someone has to do that, but it's not a huge job. I did this presentation this morning for these two sectors. So shall we go to trying Ian?
Yes, thank you, Howard. Let's do another sound check for Ian. No, we can't hear you. Wait.
You can hear me. So started.
We could hear you when you joined. Maybe worth looking
Ian,
at.
if you selected the correct microphone, I'm assuming you checked against the little arrow next to the mute button. You can. Could you use your laptop's microphone instead of your headphones? It won't be as good, but it might work. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, he's just left.
Howard, I think it would be good for you to look at a couple more questions, or I could pose a question. I think Marcella also posted some questions.
Yep, go ahead. Yes, okay. He's busy talking, I can see.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. We're
Okay. Okay. If in doubt, restart. Okay. So what I'm just going to do is we've used the program cycle and an evidence cycle very extensively in Africa, in training in Africa, particularly South Africa, but also other African countries, even with Malaysia and in the debt processes, etc. So I'm just going to share the way we conceptualize it, which I think brings a bit of clarity. I really like some of the things that Howard raised, which I'll come back to. But I think that the way we use the cycle from a policymaker perspective makes it a bit easy to think about. And we start off by saying, what's the agenda, which might be coming from a political mandate or what a minister wants to do or what a head of department wants to do. What's that agenda? And then theoretically, you should look at what is known about the problem and understand the root causes. And I really like the way Howard was talking about binding constraints. So it's not, you're focusing on which root causes are really the binding constraints. You then think about what are the options for addressing the problem, and based on that, you choose an intervention. Once you've selected your intervention, you need to design it. You're in the planning and design quadrant. And so ideally, you would do a theory of change. You'd go through a design process. You'd do your operational planning. You'd implement, you'd monitor. You'd then review and refine, and then you'd see what sort of outcomes and impacts you're getting. And as with Howard, when we use this, we look at what are some of the tools you can use. And it's not just in a sense the research tools, but so for example, there's a real art to doing problem definition, and the work that's been done, for example, under the PDIA process is really, really good at trying to unpack the problem and also to think about the root causes of the problem. And there's tools like Fishbone or Problem Tree, 5 Whys. We can use research synthesis, research synthesis and evidence maps, as Howard has pointed out. In South Africa, we also talk about diagnostic evaluation, which is trying to understand the situation. There's tools like stakeholder analysis, modeling to look at different options. Based on all this, you choose your intervention. And then based on that, you've got your planning tools, your theories of change, log frames, whatever it is, your operational planning mechanisms, etc. When it comes to the implementation, there's your management systems, your monitoring systems, how you use administrative data. And in South Africa, we also talk about implementation evaluation, which is trying to understand whether the intervention is working as intended. And then, of course, when we come to outcomes and impact, there's administrative data, which may be doing your outcome monitoring. There's evaluations like impact, economic evaluations. And there's also processes like evaluative workshops with stakeholders, which can be very valuable in this. And in the center is the process around this, which we talk about collaboration, documenting what's happening, reflecting, and learning. And this underlies the whole cycle. And the way we apply it is looking at it at a policy level, or at a program within that policy, or at a service or project within that. So bearing that in mind, and I think maybe using some of this might be helpful to clarify a bit Howard's cycle. I think what he does in terms of unpacking the diagnostic phase is really, really helpful. And both the aspect about the diagnostic phase, but also about thinking about the stages, the piloting, the efficacy and effectiveness. And we would see this cycle being applied as a pilot. You go through the whole cycle, then you could be doing your efficacy work going through the whole cycle, and then your effectiveness work going through the whole cycle. So in each case, you've got to diagnose, you've got to design, you've got to implement, and you've got to see if it's working. And we in South Africa, we actually talk about implementation evaluations, outcome evaluations, impact evaluations, and diagnostic evaluations. And I think they relate to, I mean, Howard was using formative. Formative, we have found is extremely important. And rather than seeing this as a process that must lead to impact evaluations, the formative and the process evaluations, doing implementation evaluations, are very useful in giving rapid feedback into policy processes. So the early stages of these processes are just as important as managing to get along to do your impact evaluation later. So I think the one caution though is, while it's very nice to think of the idea of doing pilot efficacy and effectiveness, in fact, it's very difficult to do that in policy processes. Policymakers in most countries I've worked with are very allergic to the idea of piloting. They don't like the idea of piloting, and it's a problem for people who have this logic, which makes a lot of sense. They want to be able to apply at full scale, whatever you do, and that's a big challenge in trying to think how one handles this. Which makes it much more complex to go through this, what would be theoretically be a very nice way of building up your knowledge and doing it. So in summary, I think we can clarify the cycle a bit, but I think many of the levels of the first generation, second generation, pilot efficacy, effectiveness, these sort of issues, and the way how it elaborates, trying to understand what's known about the problem, understanding the root cause and binding constraints, is a very useful way of trying to understand what needs to be done. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ian. I'm glad we could hear you. So, there are quite a few questions that have come through the Q&A. I was wondering whether you've had a look. Marcella has also posted some questions.
Yes, okay. I grouped them. I can go try and read them. Okay. So from Sophia, how do we do impact evaluation of testing? If you can't see these people there in the Q&A, can we do impact evaluation of testing phase in regard impact longer term change? Okay, so that's a good point. And so if some interventions, I don't define impact as necessarily being longer term outcomes. I define impact in the sense of what difference intervention made. The outcomes might be more immediate or they might be longer term. And it's indeed the case for many interventions, the theory of change will demonstrate that the intended intervention in well-being or whatever, some dimension of well-being, can take a long time to realise. And so if you want to do a pilot efficacy study over a shorter time frame, as Ian would say, if you said to a policymaker, oh, it's a great idea, we're going to do a formative evaluation over the next 2 years, and we'll the next 10 years, and then in 15 years' time, we'll start with the intervention, take it to effectiveness stage, you probably won't have a job the next day. So, you can't necessarily do that. So what you would think about doing is looking at intermediate outcomes. So we did a range of rapid impact evaluations funded by Gates on related to HIV. One was on medical malcircumcision and one was on self-testing kits. And the long-run outcomes of interest, of course, HIV incidence prevalence. But what you look at is circumcision rates and properties of self-testing kits, which are quite short-run, easy outcomes to achieve. And so you have to move down the causal chain a bit to see whether your findings consistent with what you would like to see lower down the causal chain to have some confidence that you would have effects higher up the causal chain, which then need to be tested when you go to effectiveness stage. How do you make a decision when many aspects interrelated can be contributed in terms of a project or which sector should be tackled? Yeah, so I think this is a good point, and I think it's widely recognised that, I mean, it's a development debate, but I don't agree with him on that, is when, even though you might be interested in education outcomes, it's not necessarily an education intervention you want to do. And so school-based development health intervention might be the most appropriate way of achieving an education outcome. So I don't agree in that case, but there are other cases where you want to, so let's take teenage pregnancy. So actually economic empowerment programs like cash transfers, business training are a proven effective way of reducing teenage pregnancy. And so it's not, oh, girls getting pregnant, give them contraceptives. It may not be the lack of knowledge or access to contraceptives, which is the binding constraint. It might be basically lack of agency and the need to basically be economically dependent. There's a report from, it's from UNICEF, from not that long, from two years ago or something, that's like, it's over 50% of women engage in transactional sex in Africa. So if you tackle economic want, you can remove the need for transactional sex and therefore reduce the likelihood of teenage pregnancy. So certainly intervention in different sectors might help. But the other point, and I refer to in passing, is most of the time to tackle a problem, you need multi-component interventions, teenage pregnancy is an example, because there's a behaviour change process people go through, or even communities go through, and you need to do different things at different stages of that process to support the behaviour change. And so there's this very nice film called Toilet about sanitation in India, which has some very nice scenes demonstrating basically behaviour change model, where the village women don't realise they have a problem, and the heroine of the movie is confronting them, and actually says to them, you don't realise you have a problem, about the fact that they think that open defecation is fine. And so the first stage is convincing people that actually the current behaviour is problematic, you need to change it. Once you've done that, you need to support the decision-making process to plan new behaviours, then you need to support those new behaviours in different ways. And those different behaviours might be, so in getting girls not become pregnant, part of it might be based on having role models or mentors to change their aspirations for their life. But then you want, if they change their aspirations, you want to then support that with more economic interventions. So there are different types of things you can do which might be multi-sectoral and definitely multi-component to support a behaviour change. So I'm not going to get all the questions, there are now a lot of them, but in this presentation, look at Zazie Thomas' question. It's a long question. Ian wants to answer it live. Can I hand over to you, Ian, to answer Zia's question, and I'll then read some others in the meantime. Ian?
So it's a good point. It's a good point, Zazie. There are now methods that are looking at opportunity driven processes, and that is something that we need to explore much more around at this moment. It's important to try some of these, and it's important to try and do it particularly because some of the problems we're facing are so complex and so difficult that you can get lost in your problem definitions, and you need to find the strategic levers where you can start to move forward on this. I'm actually part of something called the International Evaluation Academy, and we're beginning to look at what are some of these transformational methods that we can start to use. So I'll get back to you in a few months on that and hopefully have some answers that I can give you.
Yeah, because that wasn't the policymaker asking the question then, Ian. You're saying, I'll get back to you in 3 months. And okay, I just see a couple of questions, easier questions. Susan asked, where do we find evidence and gap maps? So as I mentioned, CEDIL did a map of maps. That was back in 2018, contains 73 maps. You can go to the CEDIL website. There's 3I did it, funded by CEDIL. You can go to the CEDIL website under pre-inception papers, you'll find the map of maps. has 73 maps. But I think the numbers are easily doubled by now. We'd like to update the map of maps, but we need someone to provide funding to do that. And then if you go to the 3i website, 3iimpact.org, they have the evidence and gap map list. A lot of the maps have been done in international development space by 3i or with support of 3IE. And they have a repository where you can find many maps. Or you go to the Campbell website, search Campbell Wiley, because Campbell was published by Wiley. We have about 20 maps ongoing, not all in industrial development. Some are in developed country policy space. So 3IE, the map of maps from CEDIL and Campbell, you can find them all. So that's actually Susan and Shabel both asked questions. Nina asked a more difficult question about the feedback loops from adaptive learning evaluation and the 3 stages of trials. I can give it, I'm going to ask another question first. I forget who asked it. Oh, it's the next one. Just disappear from the screen. Someone asked about, say, time on task, whether that can be a binding constraint, because it's like that's part of the process. So you write out the causal chain for learning outcomes, time on task is there. So my answer would be binding constraints can operate at any point along the causal chain. So you've got your idea of how, I was approaching that question, that list in the question point of view of why are children not learning? And so the first thing, they might not be in school, but if they are in school, then something's not happening in the school that should be happening. And so you precisely think about what's the theory of change by which children are meant to learn, and what are the broken or missing links in that causal chain. And so it could be a weak or broken link around what's happening in the classroom, seems very likely. And that it's probably a combination, not just on time in task, pedagogical methods and so on. So understanding that tells you where to direct your intervention. When I was doing a study of education back in Ghana in the early 2000s, USAID was funding a couple of very large projects, and the only thing they were funding was technical assistance. So for people from the US to come to Ghana and do workshops for the Ministry of Education and the what it's called the teaching authority, and teachers and head teachers themselves and so on. And they would do things like tell the importance of putting posts up on your walls and putting group desks in groups rather than in rows in traditional format and so on. And I remember going to this school where they didn't have any desks, but they actually got some logs the children sat on. They put the logs into circles. So they were trying to do what they were told. But the best quote from a teacher who said, I would like to put posters on my walls, but I don't have any posters. In fact, you can see I don't have any walls. And so the real binding constraint back in the 1990s, and this was in the early 2000s, in Ghana was basically the poor quality of education facilities, lack of schools or school classrooms that fell down or had no walls and so on. And so focusing on what happened in the classroom was nice, but that probably wasn't really the binding constraint at that point. You just needed to improve the quality of the school infrastructure. Now that's been done, largely actually by social funds, which are precursors of CDD programs, then you can focus much more, as we now are, on what happens in the classroom. Nina, you asked about feedback loops. So adaptive learning impact evaluations, you can do just what I said of doing A/B designs, where you randomly allocate different communities or different individuals to different program ideas to see which ones are more effective. And I don't have a catalogue of examples to mind I can call on. And the other thing is the going from formative evaluation to efficacy to effectiveness. I actually really need some examples for this talk. So anyone listening knows of any examples of an intervention that's really gone through those 3 stages, do let me know, and I will try and think of some so I can actually plan to write this talk up. So really it needs a good example of that to demonstrate. Should I stop now, Radhika, because we haven't answered the questions. We're getting near time.
There's 3 minutes left, and I dropped out. So I don't know whether you answered this question, which was on COVID-19. And so what do you do when sometimes problems are invisible? There is no prevalence data. And as Ian said, policymakers need quick responses, which has been happening during this pandemic. and the role of stakeholder opinions or citizen feedback in helping with problem diagnosis at that point.
Right, so the latter I think is easier because citizen feedback can help on diagnosis of a problem, and particularly citizen scorecards, which were pioneered in South Africa, I think South Africa to a large extent, can give you feedback on quality of services, identify problems. It's not just around teenage pregnancy or learning outcomes, an outcome level prevalence data, but information around lack of drugs in health facilities or other reasons why people are not accessing health facilities. So this Pakistan thing, it seems like a problem, but people clearly don't want to go to public health facilities. They want to go to private health facilities. They'd rather go to the pharmacist and buy drugs than go to a public health facility they know doesn't have any drugs, or whatever reason they don't want to go there. So those sort of citizen scorecards can actually help understand that. So go back to an earlier question, don't just say, oh, it's a problem, people don't want to go to public health clinics. You need to understand why. You do need to dig deeper, and citizen engagements, citizen scorecards, that sort of data can certainly help with that. On something like COVID, what COVID has shown, and I think people come to realise, is the extent to which a lot of what we do, well, one is there's no certainties. So I don't think everyone realised that drugs don't work for everyone all the time, but also probabilistic relationships. So they now understand, oh, here's a new COVID drug, it's 76% effective. And they have to understand what that means. So actually, drugs are not 100% effective, which people working evidence knew all along. And social programs are equally not 100% effective. Actually, they're 10 to 20% effective. That's quite good for social programs. They don't reach the level of drugs. And that's something people should be aware of. The other thing, though, COVID made people aware of is the role of modelling. So all the decisions we're making based on keep schools closed, wearing masks, social distancing, is based on modelling estimates. And models are used in epidemiology routinely for this sort of work. And these sort of structural models can and should be used in a much broader range of settings. So CEDIL does have a work stream on structural modelling. It's not a huge one, but a lot of people wanting to work on structural modelling, but actually structural modelling around the role of conditional cash transfers, but microfinance, and particularly when you're thinking about broader, both local economy-wide effects, where there's literature on this, but also actually on intra-household effects, is, and again, in the end, a modelling-based analysis. And so there should be more work on modelling and more work on doing reviews of model-based literature. So CEDIL's about advancing methods and impact evaluation. And we did do a paper on cross-learning economics and epidemiology in our inception papers. And it's basically with different uses of modelling that are used currently in the way modelling is used in the two disciplines is quite different. And I don't have time to go into that, but it's certainly a fruitful area for further research in the future years of CEDIL, which we hope will be long, many and prosperous.
Thanks very much, Howard. I think we're at time now. So I'm just going to thank everyone for participating in this webinar. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Howard. And please don't forget to fill the webinar survey that'll pop up on your screen now. So see you next time. Thank you.
Everyone, bye.
Bye.